There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to a house that has been waiting for someone to die. Not the ordinary quiet of an empty room, not the gentle hush of a place simply forgotten. This silence had weight. It pressed against the windows like something alive, thick with the smell of wet pine, rusted iron, and decades of undisturbed dust. Cordelia Wynne was 32 years old, $80,000 in debt, and sleeping in the back seat of a rented Honda Civic when the letter arrived. It was not from a collection agency, though she had stopped opening those months ago. It was from a dead woman she had met exactly once at the age of 5 and remembered only because the woman had screamed at her for touching a clock. The dead woman left Cordelia a house. No money, no explanation, no keys. The probate attorney, a man who looked like he had aged 10 years preparing the paperwork, read the will's final clause aloud with the careful discomfort of someone delivering a diagnosis. She will receive no keys. If she is meant to claim what is inside the house, we'll let her in. If it does not, she must walk away and never return. Cordelia drove 6 hours into the Oregon mountains expecting to break a window. Instead, she found the front door cracked open, the brass handle polished to a mirror shine, and a dead man behind the curtain in the library. The house had been waiting. But not for her. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to a house that has been waiting for someone to die. Not the ordinary quiet of an empty room, not the gentle hush of a place simply forgotten. This silence had weight. It pressed against the windows like something alive, thick with the smell of wet pine, rusted iron, and decades of undisturbed dust. Cordelia Wynne was 32 years old, $80,000 in debt, and sleeping in the back seat of a rented Honda Civic when the letter arrived. It was not from a collection agency, though she had stopped opening those months ago. It was from a dead woman she had met exactly once at the age of 5 and remembered only because the woman had screamed at her for touching a clock. The dead woman left Cordelia a house. No money, no explanation, no keys. The probate attorney, a man who looked like he had aged 10 years preparing the paperwork, read the will's final clause aloud with the careful discomfort of someone delivering a diagnosis. She will receive no keys. If she is meant to claim what is inside the house, we'll let her in. If it does not, she must walk away and never return. Cordelia drove 6 hours into the Oregon mountains expecting to break a window. Instead, she found the front door cracked open, the brass handle polished to a mirror shine, and a dead man behind the curtain in the library. The house had been waiting, but not for her. 6 days earlier, Cordelia Wynne had been sitting on the floor of her gutted apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, staring at the eviction notice taped to the inside of her front door. The adhesive had pulled a strip of paint from the wood, leaving a pale scar underneath, and for some reason that tiny detail bothered her more than the notice itself. She had designed buildings. She had drawn blueprints for structures that would stand for 100 years. And now she couldn't even keep the paint on her own front door. The architecture firm she had co-founded with Lowell Gentry 3 years ago was supposed to be the culmination of everything she had worked toward. Wynne and Gentry Design, she had poured every cent of her savings into the venture, maxed out 2 credit lines, and signed a personal guarantee on the office lease in Pioneer Square. Lowell handled the client relationships and the money. Cordelia handled the designs. It was supposed to be a partnership built on trust. It lasted 14 months. Lowell Gentry vanished on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not with a confrontation or a slammed door. He simply stopped answering his phone. By Thursday, Cordelia discovered that the business account had been drained. By Friday, she learned that Lowell had taken a one-way flight to Lisbon using a passport she didn't know he had. By the following Monday, the landlord changed the locks on the office and a process server handed her a stack of papers so thick it could have stopped a bullet. $80,000, that was the number that followed her everywhere now. It sat on her chest when she woke up in the morning, if she slept at all. It whispered in her ear when she brushed her teeth in gas station restrooms. It was the distance between the life she had built and the life she was living, measured in a currency she no longer possessed. She survived on freelance drafting work, the kind of tedious cadi jobs that architecture students took to pay for textbooks. She ate instant ramen and day-old bread from the market-down shelf at the corner bodega. She had sold her furniture piece by piece until there was nothing left but a sleeping bag, 2 suitcases, and a laptop with a cracked screen that she kept alive through sheer force of will. Cordelia Wynne was not the kind of woman who felt sorry for herself. She had inherited that particular stubbornness from her father, Emmett Wynne, a man who had driven a delivery truck 6 days a week and never once complained about the arthritis in his hands. Emmett used to say that self-pity was a luxury for people who had given up, and Wynnes did not give up. Emmett had died when Cordelia was 16. A hit and run on Interstate 5 just south of Olympia. The state police never found the other driver. The case went cold within 6 months. Cordelia's mother had crumbled after that, retreating into a fog of prescription medication and daytime television that lasted until her own quiet death from pneumonia 8 years later. Cordelia had been alone ever since. Alone but never idle, she had put herself through architecture school on scholarships and overnight shifts at a 24-hour copy center. She had graduated near the top of her class. She had clawed her way into a profession that was brutal even to people with connections, and she had done it with nothing but talent and an almost pathological refusal to quit, and now she was living in a car. The certified letter arrived at the last address Cordelia had registered with the post office, a P.O. box she maintained because a person without a mailing address was a person who had ceased to exist in the eyes of the American bureaucratic machine. She almost threw it away. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, the kind that collection agencies sometimes use to disguise their demands as something official. But the return address stopped her. Cavill and Associates Attorneys at Law. She didn't owe money to any law firm. Not yet, anyway. She opened it standing in the fluorescent glare of the post office lobby, reading the letter twice before the words assembled themselves into meaning. She was being summoned to the offices of Desmond Cavill regarding the estate of one Josephine Aldrich, deceased. Cordelia had no idea who Josephine Aldrich was. The name meant nothing to her. She almost threw the letter away again, certain it was a mistake or a scam designed to prey on desperate people. But something about the language, the formality, the weight of the paper gave her pause. She called the number on the letterhead from a payphone outside a gas station. The receptionist confirmed the appointment and told her that her attendance was, in the firm's words, strongly recommended. 2 days later, Cordelia sat in a leather chair across from Desmond Cavill in his office on the 32nd floor of a downtown Seattle high-rise. The office was immaculate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay, the water gray and restless under a heavy autumn sky. The furniture was old money, dark wood, brass fixtures, the kind of quiet opulence that whispered rather than shouted. Cavill himself was a man in his late 60s, tall and thin, with the deliberate posture of someone who had spent a lifetime in courtrooms. His suit was charcoal gray, pressed to a razor crease. His eyes were the color of weak tea, and they held the particular weariness of a man who had seen too many families tear themselves apart over the contents of a dead person's filing cabinet. He studied Cordelia with a careful measuring gaze that made her feel like she was being appraised. Josephine Aldrich was your maternal grandfather's sister? Cavill began, folding his hands over a thick manila file. Your great-aunt, in the simplest terms. She was estranged from the family completely and deliberately. To my knowledge, she had not spoken to any member of the Wynne family since approximately 1988. I don't remember her, Cordelia said. That was not entirely true. She had a single memory, thin and fragile as old glass. She was 5 years old, standing in a house that smelled like peppermint and mothballs. There was a tall woman with white hair and sharp cheekbones, and Cordelia had reached for a clock on a mantelpiece, a beautiful thing with a brass face and delicate hands. The woman had shouted so loudly that Cordelia had burst into tears. That was all she had of Josephine Aldrich. A shout and the smell of peppermint. She lived alone, Cavill continued, on a property in Willow Creek, Oregon, a small logging town in the Cascades. The property is known locally as Ravenwood. It is a substantial estate, 3 stories, approximately 9,000 square feet, situated on 47 acres of old-growth forest. And she left it to me, Cordelia said flatly. A woman who screamed at me for touching a clock 30 years ago left me a house. She did, free and clear, along with a modest trust fund sufficient to cover the property taxes for the next 5 years. There are, however, conditions. Cavill reached into his desk drawer and produced a small box lined in dark velvet. He opened it. Inside was nothing but a single folded piece of heavy parchment yellowed with age. There are no keys to Ravenwood, Cavill said. Josephine's will explicitly instructs that all existing keys were to be melted down upon her death. The locks were not to be changed. He unfolded the parchment and read aloud, his voice flat and precise. To my great niece Cordelia Wynne I leave the house and all its burdens. She will receive no keys. If she is meant to claim what is inside, the house will let her in. If it does not, she must walk away and never return. A beat of silence passed between them. Cordelia let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. Is this a joke? Am I supposed to knock and ask politely, I am merely the executor, Miss Wynne, Cavill replied, and something flickered behind his careful expression, something that might have been sympathy or might have been warning. Legally, the property is yours. Whether you choose to hire a locksmith, use a crowbar, or attempt a more creative method of entry is entirely your prerogative, but I will tell you what I told the court. Josephine Aldrich was a deeply private, deeply cautious woman. I would advise the same caution in approaching anything she left behind. Cordelia studied the old attorney for a long moment. There was something he was not telling her. She could feel it in the careful way he chose his words, in the slight tension around his mouth when he spoke with Josephine's name. But $80,000 of debt has a way of simplifying a person's decision-making process. A 9,000 square foot estate on 47 acres in Oregon was worth something, even if it was falling apart, even if the previous owner was clearly insane. I'll take it, Cordelia said. Cavill nodded slowly as if he had expected nothing less and wished he had expected something different. Then I suggest you bring warm clothing, Miss Wynne. Willow Creek is not a hospitable place this time of year. The drive from Seattle to Willow Creek took 6 hours on a good day. This was not a good day. A heavy Pacific storm system had settled over the Cascades like a wet gray blanket, dumping sheets of cold rain that reduced visibility to less than 50 feet on the higher switchbacks. Cordelia gripped the steering wheel of her rented Honda with both hands, her knuckles white, navigating roads that seemed designed to punish anyone foolish enough to use them. The towns grew smaller as she drove south and east. Suburbs gave way to farmland. Farmland gave way to timber country. The trees closed in on both sides of the highway, towering Douglas firs and western red cedars that blocked out what little gray light the clouds allowed. Cell service vanished somewhere around milepost 140, the signal bars dropping one by one until the phone in her pocket became nothing more than an expensive paperweight. Willow Creek appeared without warning. One moment there was nothing but forest and rain. The next a cluster of sagging buildings materialized on both sides of a 2-lane road. A boarded-up gas station, a general store with a hand-painted sign so faded the letters had become ghosts, a post office the size of a garden shed, a bar called the Ridgeline with 3 mud-caked pickup trucks in the gravel lot. Cordelia pulled into the gravel parking area in front of the general store. She needed directions. Cavill had given her a hand-drawn map, but the rain and the failing light made the logging roads indistinguishable from one another. She stepped out of the car and immediately felt the cold wrap around her like a living thing. The air was different here, thin and sharp, carrying the scent of wet earth, pine resin, and something metallic that she couldn't identify. The town was quiet in a way that Seattle never was. No traffic, no distant sirens, no hum of electricity, just the rain drumming against rooftops and the low creak of trees bending in the wind. The door of the ridgeline opened, spilling a brief rectangle of warm yellow light into the gray afternoon. A woman stepped out, zipping up a dark green rain jacket. She was approximately 40 with short auburn hair tucked under a baseball cap and a face that was handsome rather than pretty, the kind of face that had spent years outdoors and carried the evidence without apology. A silver badge was clipped to her belt. "You lost?" the woman asked, and her voice was friendly in the way that a closed hand is friendly when it's held out for a handshake. Cordelia noticed that the woman had already been watching her before she stepped out of the bar. That the question was not casual. "Looking for a property called the Ravenwood," Cordelia said. "Up the mountain. I'm the new owner." Something shifted behind the woman's eyes. It was fast, barely a flicker, but Cordelia caught it the way a person catches a shadow at the edge of their vision. Recognition. And underneath it, something harder. Calculation. "Bertie Calloway," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm the sheriff here in Willow Creek, or what passes for one. We don't get enough trouble to justify the title most days." Cordelia shook her hand. The grip was firm and dry and lasted exactly 1 second longer than it should have. "You're Josephine's kin," Bertie said, and it was not a question. "We heard she passed. I'm sorry for your loss." "I didn't really know her." "Nobody did. She kept to herself up there. 20-some years without so much as a wave from the road." Bertie paused, adjusting her cap against the rain. "You planning on going up there tonight in this weather? I need to assess the property." Bertie looked at her for a long moment, and the friendliness in her expression thinned just enough to reveal something underneath. Not hostility, something closer to appetite. "I wouldn't recommend it," Bertie said slowly. "That road washes out in heavy rain. And the property itself, well, it's been sitting empty. Things deteriorate. The last person who went up that road to check on the place didn't come back down for 3 days. Got stuck in the mud and had to hike out." "I appreciate the concern," Cordelia said, "but I've driven 6 hours and I'd like to see what I've inherited before dark." Bertie held her gaze for another beat, then nodded. "Fair enough. Take the logging road past the old sawmill, stay left at the fork. You'll see the gates. Big iron things, can't miss them." She paused. "If you run into trouble, you won't get a cell signal up there. Nearest landline is back here at the bar. I'm usually around." "Thank you, Sheriff." Cordelia got back in the car. As she pulled out of the gravel lot, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Bertie Calloway was still standing in the rain, watching her leave. She had not moved. She had pulled out a small handheld radio and was speaking into it. Cordelia filed that detail away and kept driving. The logging road climbed steeply through dense forest, unpaved and rutted, the Honda's tires fighting for purchase on the slick red mud. The trees pressed close on both sides, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy so thick that the gray afternoon light was reduced to a perpetual twilight. Rain hammered the windshield in sheets. The wipers struggled to keep pace. After 20 minutes of climbing, the road leveled briefly, and the trees fell back to reveal a pair of towering wrought iron gates. They were at least 12 feet tall, the metalwork heavily oxidized and woven thick with aggressive tendrils of English ivy. Ornate scrollwork at the top might have once spelled a name, but corrosion had reduced it to abstract shapes. The gates were not chained. They stood slightly ajar, pushed inward, as if someone had forced them open and never bothered to close them again. The gap was just wide enough for a car to pass through. Cordelia stopped the Honda and stared at the opening. Rain slid down the windshield in unbroken sheets. Beyond the gates, a gravel driveway disappeared into the trees, curving upward and out of sight. She thought about Bertie Calloway standing in the rain with that radio. She thought about the $80,000. She drove through the gates. The driveway curved through 300 yards of dense forest before the trees finally relented and Ravenwood revealed itself. Cordelia stopped the car and turned off the engine. She sat for a full minute, staring through the rain-streaked windshield at the structure before her. She had studied architecture for 4 years. She had spent a decade designing buildings. She had walked through houses and office towers and churches and industrial complexes in every state of construction and decay. She understood buildings the way a surgeon understands a body, not just the surface, but the skeleton underneath the systems that kept it breathing, the joints where stress accumulated and failure began. Ravenwood was a masterwork of Victorian Gothic architecture, and it was dying. 3 stories of dark weather-beaten timber rose against the backdrop of the dense evergreen forest like a monument to abandonment. The roofline was a jagged silhouette of sharp gables and narrow dormers, the kind of aggressive verticality that Victorian architects used to make buildings feel like they were reaching toward heaven or clawing their way out of the earth. Narrow windows stared out from the facade like hollow eyes. A wrap-around porch encircled the ground floor, sagging badly on the eastern side where the support posts had begun to rot. The surrounding gardens had long since gone feral, exploding into a chaotic wilderness of dead rhododendrons, blackberry brambles, and skeletal rose bushes. But even through the decay, Cordelia could see the bones, and the bones were extraordinary. The proportions were perfect. The craftsmanship of the original timber framing, visible where the exterior cladding had peeled away, was museum quality. Someone had built this house with a kind of obsessive precision that bordered on devotion, and then someone had modified it. Cordelia's trained eye caught the discrepancies immediately. The foundation was wrong. A house of this era would have been built on a stone or brick foundation, but the base of Ravenwood had been reinforced with modern poured concrete, the kind of work that suggested structural upgrades far beyond simple maintenance. The walls were too thick. She could tell from the depth of the window reveals that the exterior walls were at least 18 inches deep, nearly double what the original construction would have required. And the window glass, while dirty and weathered, had a faint greenish tint that she recognized. It was laminated security glass, the kind used in embassy buildings and bank vaults. Someone had turned this Victorian mansion into a fortress, and they had done it carefully enough that a casual observer would never notice. Cordelia zipped up her waterproof jacket, grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the freezing rain. She had a crowbar in her duffel bag in the trunk. Her plan was simple: get inside, take photographs for the real estate listing, assess the structural damage, and get back to Seattle as fast as possible. List the property with a rural specialist, sell it for whatever the market would bear, and start digging herself out of the financial crater Lowell Gentry had left behind. She climbed the porch steps, carefully testing each board with her weight before committing. The wood groaned but held. The porch itself was littered with years of accumulated debris. Dead leaves, pine needles, the desiccated corpse of a bird that had crawled under the railing to die. A rocking chair sat in the corner, its runners buried in moss. The front doors were massive double panels of hand-carved oak darkened with age and exposure. The carvings depicted intertwined branches and leaves, the kind of decorative work that would have taken a master craftsman months to complete. The wood around the door frame was swollen and cracked, the finish long since weathered away. But the brass handle on the right door was polished, not just free of tarnish, polished to a warm buttery shine that caught the weak grey light and threw it back, as if someone had buffed it that morning. And the door was not fully closed. A gap of roughly 3 inches separated the door from the frame, revealing a vertical slice of absolute blackness from the interior. Cordelia stood perfectly still. The hair on the back of her neck rose. The rain drummed against her hood and dripped from the brim in a steady curtain. Through the narrow gap, a cold draft sighed outward, carrying with it a complex bouquet of scents: dried lavender, old dust, and underneath both a sharp metallic tang that she recognized instinctively as copper. The smell of blood, if she is meant to claim what is inside the house, will let her in. Every rational instinct told her to turn around, get back in the Honda, drive until the cell signal returned, call the police, call Cavill, call anyone. But Cordelia Wynne had been running from things her entire adult life. Running from death, from failure, from the memory of a father who died on a highway and a mother who died in an armchair. Running had brought her to a parking lot in Seattle where she slept in the back seat of a rented car and ate cold noodles out of a styrofoam cup. She was done running. She wrapped her gloved hand around the polished brass handle and pushed. The door swung inward with a long, agonized creak that echoed through the space beyond like a moan from the walls themselves. Cordelia raised her flashlight and sent a beam of harsh white light stabbing into the darkness. The grand foyer of Ravenwood was a cathedral of neglect. The ceiling soared 20 feet overhead, draped in thick gray cobwebs that swayed in the draught like funeral veils. A sweeping mahogany staircase dominated the center of the room, its steps covered in a moth-eaten carpet runner that might once have been deep crimson but had faded to the color of dried blood. Furniture was pushed against the walls and covered in white dust sheets that looked in the jittery beam of the flashlight like hunched figures frozen in the act of rising. The hardwood floor was coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust and grime that recorded every detail like fresh snow. Cordelia stepped inside. Her boots left sharp, clean impressions in the dust. She eased the door closed behind her, and the darkness became absolute except for her flashlight. "Hello," she called. Her voice was immediately swallowed by the vastness of the house, absorbed by the heavy curtains and the dust-choked carpets and the sheer volume of empty space. "I'm the owner. Is anyone here?" Silence. The kind of silence that does not mean the absence of people, the kind that means someone is listening. Cordelia swept the flashlight beam across the floor to orient herself, and that was when she saw them. Footprints. Not hers. A second set of tracks already present in the dust leading away from the front door and down a corridor to the right. They belonged to large, heavy-treaded boots. The kind of boots worn by men who expected to walk through rough terrain. And the edges of the prints were sharp, undisturbed by air currents or settling dust. These tracks had been made recently, not weeks ago, not days ago, hours. Cordelia tightened her grip on the heavy metal flashlight. It was solid and weighty in her hand, a weapon if she needed one. She considered retreating. She considered the crowbar in her duffel bag still in the trunk of the Honda, 60 feet and a lifetime away. She followed the footprints. The tracks led down a long, narrow corridor paneled in dark wood. Framed portraits lined both walls, stern faces from another century, whose painted eyes seemed to track the beam of her light as she passed. The air grew warmer as she moved deeper into the house, and the smell of dust gave way to something else. Wood smoke, and behind it faintly the aroma of black tea. The corridor opened through a wide archway into a room that stopped Cordelia in her tracks. The library was immaculate. Where the foyer had been a tomb of dust and decay, this room was alive. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, packed with leather-bound volumes whose spines gleamed in warm light. The floor was polished hardwood, not a speck of dust. The cobwebs that festooned every other room were absent here, as if the neglect of the house stopped precisely at this threshold. In a massive stone hearth, a fire roared, casting shifting orange light across the furniture. Two plush leather armchairs faced the fire. Between them, on a small carved side table, sat a silver tray. On the tray were a steaming porcelain teapot and 2 cups. 2 cups. Someone had been expecting her. I was beginning to wonder if the storm had washed out the lower bridge. The voice came from the far corner of the room, half concealed by the high back of a reading chair positioned away from the fire. Cordelia gasped and swung the flashlight toward the sound like a weapon. "Lower the light, please, Miss Wynne. I have had a very long day, and the migraine is already more than I care to manage." Cordelia did not lower it. "Who are you? How do you know my name? I will find a way to call the police." "With what signal?" the voice replied calmly. A man stood up from the reading chair and stepped into the firelight. He was in his late 50s, dressed in a manner that was so incongruous with the surroundings that Cordelia momentarily wondered if she was hallucinating. A crisp tweed vest over a white-collared shirt, dark wool trousers, a neatly trimmed grey beard framing a face that was weathered but sharp, dominated by pale blue eyes that held a strange mixture of exhaustion and intelligence. He did not look like a squatter or a vagrant. He looked like a man who had been waiting for someone for a very long time and was not entirely pleased that they had finally arrived. "My name is Isaac Keller," the man said, keeping his hands visible, resting them on the back of the chair. "I am not a trespasser. I have lived in this house for the past 22 years. "That's impossible. My great-aunt lived here alone." The lawyer said she was a recluse. "Your great-aunt Josephine was a great many things," Isaac said softly, walking toward the tea tray with the deliberate calm of a man who understood that sudden movements would get him hit with a flashlight. "But she was never alone. She hired me when I was 35 to serve as the custodian of Ravenwood, but more accurately, she hired me as its warden." "Warden of what?" Isaac poured a cup of tea. The liquid was dark amber, and the steam curled upward in the firelight like smoke signals. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he lifted the cup, took a slow sip, and set it down with a soft clink of porcelain against silver. "Before I answer that question," he said, "I need you to step behind this chair and look at what is on the floor." Something in his tone made Cordelia's stomach drop. It was not a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was the voice of a man delivering bad news that he had been carrying alone for too long. She kept the flashlight aimed at his face as she circled the armchair. She looked down. A man lay on the polished floor behind the heavy velvet curtain near the window. He was face down, one arm twisted underneath his body, the other stretched out toward the wall as if he had been reaching for something when he fell. He was dressed in black tactical clothing. A holstered sidearm was still strapped to his thigh. A dark stain had spread from beneath his torso across the hardwood, thick and almost black in the dim light. He had been dead for less than a day. The blood had not yet fully dried. Cordelia stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. His name, or at least the name on the identification he was carrying, was not real, Isaac said from behind her, his voice flat and controlled. "He arrived at Ravenwood approximately 12 hours before you did. He came through the kitchen entrance with a set of lock-picking tools and a suppressed handgun. I did not have the luxury of asking his intentions." "You killed him. He would have killed you, and he would not have lost sleep over it." Cordelia backed toward the archway, her flashlight trembling in her grip. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of this house, away from this man and the body on the floor, back to the car, back to Seattle, back to the simple misery of death and homelessness that at least did not involve corpses. "If you run," Isaac said quietly, "you will die before you reach your car. And I say that not as a threat, but as a statement of fact." He walked to the mahogany desk near the shattered window. Glass shards littered the polished floor, glinting in the firelight. Isaac reached underneath the desk and pressed something. A quiet mechanical click resonated through the room. A section of the floor-to-ceiling bookshelf swung outward on concealed hinges, revealing a bank of high-definition security monitors. The anachronism was dizzying, flat-screen technology hidden behind century-old leather-bound books. Modern cables running behind hand-carved mahogany. Isaac tapped a keyboard and the monitors flickered to life, displaying grayscale surveillance footage from cameras positioned around the estate. Your great aunt was not merely a wealthy recluse, Isaac set his eyes on the screens. In the late 1980s, Josephine Aldrich was a senior forensic auditor for an independent oversight committee attached to the Department of Defense. She was assigned to investigate a private military contractor called Stratton Mercer Group. Cordelia knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Stratton Mercer was a colossus in the defense industry, a corporation so deeply embedded in the American military apparatus that it was practically a branch of the government. Their logo appeared on everything from fighter jet components to surveillance satellites. Their CEO had testified before Congress more times than most senators. She found a discrepancy. Isaac continued tapping keys to cycle through camera angles. A systematic embezzlement operation funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into off-the-books programs, specifically illegal chemical weapons testing conducted on foreign soil and later on domestic soil as well. When Josephine attempted to report her findings through proper channels, she discovered that the corruption reached into the Department of Defense itself. 3 days after filing her preliminary report, her apartment in Arlington, Virginia, was firebombed. Cordelia stared at him. The fire crackled in the hearth. Rain hammered against the windows. Josephine survived, Isaac said. She took the primary source evidence, the original ledgers, shipping manifests, financial records, and she disappeared. She purchased this property through a chain of shell corporations, retrofitted it into a secure facility, and spent the next 3 decades building a case so comprehensive that no court, no agency, and no amount of corporate money could make it disappear. He pointed to a monitor displaying the rusted iron gates Cordelia had driven through less than an hour ago. Stratton Mercer spent 30 years searching for her. 2 weeks ago, they finally succeeded. You said she died of natural causes, Cordelia whispered. The death certificate said cardiac arrest. Thallium, Isaac replied. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. A heavy metal poison, odorless, tasteless, nearly undetectable in small doses. It was introduced into her weekly grocery delivery by a compromised courier over a period of approximately 6 months. The symptoms mimic natural cardiac decline. By the time I recognized what was happening, she had already lost most of her motor function. He turned from the monitors and faced Cordelia directly. The firelight carved deep lines into his face. But before she died, Josephine initiated a lockdown protocol on the evidence vault beneath this house. A protocol that even I cannot bypass. She wrote the access requirements into her will, knowing that Cavill would eventually bring you here, because the vault responds to one thing and one thing only. Bloodline, Cordelia said. The word tasted like copper in her mouth. Your bloodline, Josephine's DNA shared through your maternal grandfather's line, is the only key that will open the vault. Cordelia shook her head. The absurdity of it crashed against the reality of the dead man on the floor and the armed men in the forest, and produced a sound in her mind like breaking glass. This is insane. All of it. You're telling me that a woman I met once when I was 5 years old built a secret underground vault full of evidence against $1 billion corporation, got herself murdered, and left the whole thing to me because of my blood? Yes, Isaac said simply. And the lawyer, Cavill, does he know about all this? Isaac's expression darkened. Something moved behind his eyes that looked like anger held on a very short leash. Desmond Cavill is a complicated question that I do not have time to answer right now. What I can tell you is this. He pointed to monitor 4. Cordelia looked. The image was from a thermal camera, and the display showed the dense forest behind the estate's carriage house rendered in shades of cold blue and black. Moving through the trees, methodical and deliberate, were 3 bright white silhouettes. They were spread in a tactical formation spaced 15 meters apart. Each silhouette carried a long object held at a low ready position across their chest, rifles. They breached the eastern perimeter at dawn, Isaac said, his voice dropping to a register that Cordelia felt in her sternum. The man on the floor was their advance scout. I have barricaded the western wing, but they are not here to negotiate. They are a retrieval team employed by Stratton Mercer, and they are here for the contents of the vault. He turned to her, and for the first time the careful composure cracked. Underneath was something raw and urgent. They let you through the gates because they need you. Your blood is the key and they know it, but once that vault is open, you become a liability, a loose end, the kind of problem that Stratton Mercer has been solving for 30 years by making people disappear. The figures on the thermal camera had reached the tree line. They were 200 yards from the house and closing. I need you to open the vault before they breach the house, Isaac said. Not for me, not for Josephine, for the people whose names are in those files. The people who were used as test subjects and buried in unmarked graves. The people nobody remembers. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. And for your father, Cordelia, Emmett Wynne did not die in a hit-and-run accident. He was murdered on Interstate 5 because he was carrying evidence for Josephine. He was killed by Stratton Mercer because he refused to hand over a ledger that proved the bribery of a federal judge. The world tilted. Cordelia felt the floor shift beneath her feet as if the house itself had lurched on its foundation. 16 years of grief, the hollow ache that had lived in the center of her chest since she was a teenager standing in a hospital corridor being told that her father was gone, suddenly detonated into something entirely different. Not sadness, rage. A white-hot crystalline fury that burned through the fear and the confusion and the exhaustion and left behind something hard and clear and absolutely certain. Her father had not been taken by chance. He had been taken by choice, by men in boardrooms who calculated the value of a human life against the value of a profit margin and found the profit margin heavier. On the monitor, the 3 thermal signatures reached the edge of the tree line and stopped. One of them raised a hand to his ear. They were communicating, coordinating, preparing to move. Cordelia looked at Isaac Keller. She looked at the dead man on the floor. She looked at the monitors showing armed men crouching in the forest, 200 yards from where she stood. She set down her flashlight. She pulled off her wet gloves and shoved them into her jacket pocket. Show me the vault, she said. Isaac did not waste time with gratitude or reassurance. He simply turned from the monitors and moved toward the library door with the measured urgency of a man who had rehearsed this scenario in his mind 1,000 times and hoped he would never have to perform it. Stay close, do not touch the walls in the corridor. Some of the defensive mechanisms your great-aunt installed are still armed, and I have not had time to deactivate all of them. Cordelia followed him out of the library and into the dark hallway. The warmth of the fire vanished instantly, replaced by the damp, biting cold that permeated the rest of the house. Their footsteps echoed against the hardwood, too loud in the suffocating silence. The portraits on the walls watched them pass with painted eyes that seemed to shift in the erratic beam of Cordelia's flashlight. How much do you know about the layout of this house? Isaac asked, without turning around. I know it's been modified, Cordelia said. The foundation is reinforced concrete, not original stone. The walls are double thickness. The windows are laminated security glass. Someone spent a fortune turning this place into a bunker and did it well enough that you'd have to be an architect to notice. Isaac glanced back at her. In the dim light, she caught something in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Respect. Josephine designed most of the modifications herself, he said. She was not a trained architect, but she had an engineer's mind. She studied fortification principles for years before she began the renovation. The exterior walls contain a layer of Kevlar sheeting between the original timber and the interior plaster. The foundation extends 14 feet below grade, twice the depth of the original cellar. The house has its own water supply from a capped well, a diesel generator with a 6-month fuel reserve, and a ventilation system with chemical filtration. She was preparing for a siege. She was preparing for exactly what is happening right now. They reached a narrow door at the end of the corridor, different from the others. It was steel painted to look like wood set into a reinforced frame. Isaac produced a key from his vest pocket, a real one, this time heavy and black and modern, and unlocked it. Behind the door, a steep flight of stone stairs descended into darkness. The air that rose from below was frigid, carrying the mineral smell of damp earth and old concrete. The cellar has 3 levels, Isaac said as they descended. The first is the original wine cellar from the 1890s. The second is a storage level that Josephine excavated in 1994. The third is the vault. Each level is separated by a reinforced barrier. The stone stairs opened into the first cellar level. It was exactly what Cordelia expected. Rows of empty wooden wine racks, their slots thick with cobwebs. Discarded furniture draped in rotting canvas, a workbench covered in rusted tools. The floor was packed earth, and their footsteps made soft, muffled sounds that were swallowed by the darkness beyond the flashlight's reach. Cordelia swept the beam across the space, and her architect's eye began working automatically, reading the room the way a doctor reads an X-ray. She stopped. Isaac? What is it? The load-bearing wall on the east side, the one separating this cellar from the foundation. She walked to it and pressed her palm flat against the stone. This wall isn't structural, it's a partition. The mortar pattern is different from the original construction, newer. And the stones are river rock, not the quarried granite used in the rest of the foundation. Isaac stared at her. Josephine built that wall in 93. She told me it was a reinforcement. It's not a reinforcement, it's a screen. There's a void behind it. I can tell from the acoustic response. Cordelia rapped her knuckles against the stone in 3 places, listening to the sound each impact produced. The first 2 returned a solid thud. The third produced a distinctly hollow resonance. The wall is approximately 8 inches thick at this point, but behind it there is at least a 4-foot cavity before the next solid surface. Your employer built something back here that she didn't tell you about. Isaac was silent for a long moment. The implications moved across his face like clouds across a landscape. We don't have time to investigate that now, he said finally. But I want you to remember it. If we survive tonight, that wall needs to come down. They continued deeper into the cellar, descending a second steeper flight of stairs that had been cut directly into the bedrock. The walls changed from mortared stone to raw granite glistening with moisture. The temperature dropped further, and Cordelia's breath came out in thin white plumes that hung in the still air like ghosts. The second level was sparse and utilitarian. Concrete floor, concrete walls, fluorescent light fixtures bolted to the ceiling, currently dark. Metal shelving units lined the walls, holding plastic bins labeled in Josephine's precise handwriting. Water purification supplies, medical equipment, canned food with expiration dates stretching back 2 decades. This was not a cellar, it was a survival bunker. At the far end of the second level, they reached the dead end. A solid wall of mortared river stone, identical in appearance to the cellar walls around it. No seams, no hinges, no indication that it was anything other than the natural terminus of the excavation. Here, Isaac said. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small brass medallion, heavy and dark with age. The surface was engraved with a pattern that Cordelia could not make out in the dim light. Isaac pressed the medallion firmly into a specific stone, one that was set slightly deeper than its neighbors by perhaps 1/4 of an inch. A difference so subtle that a person could stand in front of this wall for a year and never notice it. A sound responded, not a click or a snap, but a deep pneumatic hiss that resonated through the stone and into Cordelia's chest. She felt it in her teeth. The wall split. The river stone facade was mounted on a hydraulic armature concealed within the rock face. The two halves retracted outward, smooth and silent, despite their massive weight revealing what lay behind. A door, but calling it a door was like calling a battleship a boat. It was a slab of industrial steel at least 4 inches thick, set into a frame of reinforced concrete. The surface was smooth and featureless except for a single decorative element mounted at its center, a brass plate cast in the shape of a lion's head. The lion's mouth was open, its jaws forming a dark oval cavity approximately 4 inches deep. There was no keypad, no keyhole, no handle, no visible mechanism of any kind. The biometric lock, Cordelia said. It analyzes a blood sample for a specific genetic marker, Isaac explained. The marker is present in Josephine's maternal line, by extension in yours. You place your hand inside the mouth, press down and hold still. The mechanism will prick your finger, draw a small sample and run the analysis. If the marker is present, the magnetic locks disengage. If it is not, the system enters a permanent lockdown that I cannot override. And if it enters lockdown, then the evidence dies with this house and Stratton Mercer wins. Cordelia stared at the brass lion. Its eyes were empty sockets, dark and depthless. The open mouth was a void that promised nothing. She thought about her father, Emmett Wynne, with his calloused hands and his quiet laugh and the way he used to hum old country songs while he cooked breakfast on Sunday mornings. She thought about the last time she saw him standing in the doorway of their small house in Tacoma, his truck keys in his hand, telling her he would be back by dinner. He never came back, and now she knew why. Before I put my hand in that thing, Cordelia said, her voice steady despite the cold, I want to know who you really are, Isaac, not the version you rehearsed, the truth. Isaac's jaw tightened. In the harsh red glow of the emergency lighting from the stairwell above, the lines in his face deepened into crevices. He looked in that moment like a man standing at the edge of a cliff he had been walking toward for 22 years. The truth, he repeated, as if tasting the word. You're too calm for a custodian. You killed a man upstairs without hesitation. You know how to read tactical formations on a thermal camera. You move like someone who has been trained to move through dangerous spaces. I need to know what you were before you became a warden. Isaac was quiet for what felt like a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The careful professorial cadence was gone. What replaced it was rawer, rougher, stripped of the veneer he had maintained since the library. 25 years ago, I was a security contractor employed by Stratton Mercer Group. I was part of their Special Operations Division, a unit that did not officially exist. Our job was to locate and neutralize threats to Stratton Mercer's classified programs, human threats. The words landed on Cordelia like stones dropped from a height, each one heavier than the last. I was part of the team tasked with finding Josephine Aldrich after she disappeared with the evidence. We spent 3 years tracking her across 6 states. We were very good at what we did, and we did not care about the methods we used to do it. You were a hunter, Cordelia said. You hunted my great aunt. Yes. And my father, did you hunt him too? Isaac closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet, and the firelight from the stairwell above caught the moisture and turned it to amber. I did not kill Emmett, I need you to know that. But I knew about the operation. I knew they had identified him as a courier. I knew they had authorized his elimination, and I did nothing to stop it because I was still following orders and telling myself that the chain of command absolved me of personal responsibility. His voice cracked on the last word. He pressed his palm flat against the cold steel of the vault door as if steadying himself against a physical blow. I was in Montana when it happened. Stratton Mercer had a facility there, a private prison, where they conducted chemical weapons testing on inmates, men that the system had already forgotten, men that no one would miss. I saw what they did to those men, Cordelia. I saw the footage. I read the medical reports, and something inside me something that I had spent years burying under duty and discipline and willful ignorance, finally broke. He turned to face her. I found Josephine before the rest of my team could. I came to her door not as a hunter, but as a man who could no longer live with what he had been a part of. I offered her everything I knew about Stratton Mercer's operations, their personnel, their methods, their vulnerabilities. In exchange, she gave me a purpose, something to protect instead of destroy. You've been hiding here for 22 years, Cordelia said, guarding a dead woman's secrets, guarding the proof that the dead deserve justice, and trying every single day to earn back something that I lost the moment I chose not to pick up the phone and warn your father that they were coming for him. The silence that followed was so complete that Cordelia could hear her own heartbeat echoing off the concrete walls. She looked at Isaac Keller, this man who had spent more than 2 decades living in the shadow of a house that was not his, guarding evidence that could bring down an empire, carrying a guilt that had hollowed him out from the inside like water cutting through limestone. She thought about killing him, not seriously, not as a plan, but as a reflex, the way the mind flashes to violence when it encounters a pain so large that the body wants to match it with something equally destructive. This man had stood by while her father was murdered. He had known and done nothing, and that nothing had shaped the entire trajectory of her life. But he had also spent 22 years trying to make it right, 22 years of solitude, of vigilance, of living with the knowledge that no amount of service could undo a single phone call he did not make. Cordelia looked at the brass lion on the vault door. She looked at Isaac. She made a decision that was not about forgiveness, because forgiveness was a luxury she could not yet afford. It was about arithmetic. She needed him alive to survive the night, and the dead men in those Montana prison files needed her alive to receive their justice. When this is over, she said quietly, you and I are going to have a very different conversation, but right now I need you to tell me what happens after the vault opens. Something shifted in Isaac's posture. The terrible tension that had been building in his shoulders released by a fraction. Not relief. Recognition, the recognition of a debt acknowledged, if not yet collected. Inside the vault is a computer terminal connected to a series of encrypted servers. The servers contain the digitized copies of everything. Financial records, internal communication, shipping, manifest, offshore bank account records, and video evidence from the Montana facility. There is also a physical safe containing the original handwritten ledgers and a ruggedized hard drive with a portable copy of the data. How do we get it out? I copy the data to the portable drive. We take the drive and the decryption key, a physical cipher book, and we leave through the escape tunnel. What escape tunnel? A bootlegger's passage from the Prohibition era. Josephine discovered it during the renovation and extended it. It runs approximately half a mile through the bedrock and exits near the old logging highway on the north side of the mountain. And the house? Isaac hesitated. For the first time since they had met, he looked away from her. Josephine called it the Oak Haven Protocol, he said. The house is rigged with incendiary charges placed at key structural points. If the vault is breached or if the evidence is at risk of falling into Stratton Mercer's hands, the entire estate is to be destroyed. The charges are tied to a manual override at the terminal inside the vault. You're going to burn the house down. I'm going to ensure that Stratton Mercer finds nothing but ash, and I'm going to hold the override so that you have time to reach the highway, Isaac. This is what I was kept alive to do, Cordelia. This is the only debt I can still pay. Above them, somewhere in the upper floors of the house, a sound shattered the silence. A deep concussive boom that shook dust from the ceiling and sent a tremor through the concrete floor. It was not thunder, it was a breaching charge, military-grade explosive designed to blow through a reinforced door in a single detonation. The fluorescent lights in the second-level bunker flickered violently and died. Absolute darkness swallowed them. Cordelia's flashlight was the only source of light in the world, a thin white beam cutting through the black like a lifeline. 3 seconds later, a low guttural hum vibrated through the floor as the backup generator kicked in somewhere deep in the foundation. Red emergency lights sputtered to life along the ceiling, bathing the bunker in a harsh crimson glow that made everything look like it was bleeding. Then came the footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, tactical boots on hardwood directly above them, multiple sets moving with coordinated precision through the rooms of the upper house. They've breached the kitchen entrance, Isaac said, his voice dropping to a controlled whisper. We have minutes, perhaps less. Cordelia turned to the brass lion on the vault door. The empty eye socket stared back at her. The open mouth waited, dark and patient. She did not hesitate. She shoved her right hand into the cold brass jaws and pressed down. The mechanism engaged instantly. A sharp, precise sting sliced into the pad of her index finger, deep enough to draw blood, but clean enough that the pain was secondary to the surprise. She gasped and instinctively tried to pull her hand back, but a hidden mechanical clamp locked around her wrist with a soft pneumatic hiss, holding her in place. It's drawing the sample, Isaac said urgently, positioning himself between Cordelia and the stairwell facing the darkness above. Hold still, do not fight the clamp. Cordelia's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her temples. Her blood pulsed against the mechanism's needle, warm and bright in the freezing air. Somewhere inside the door she could hear tiny mechanical sounds. Clicks, whirs, the faint hum of electronics performing an analysis that would determine whether she lived or died in the next 5 minutes. Above them, the cellar door was kicked open. The sound was enormous in the confined space, a flat percussive bang that echoed down the stone stairwell like a gunshot. Tactical flashlight beams sliced through the darkness at the top of the stairs, cutting white lines through the red emergency glow. Target is in the basement, move, move, move. A harsh, commanding voice. American accent, the clipped cadence of military training. Heavy boots hit the stone stairs, coming down fast, professional, controlled. Cordelia squeezed her eyes shut. Her finger throbbed inside the mechanism. The clamp held her wrist immobile. She could not run. She could not hide. She was pinned to the door like a butterfly on a board, and armed men were descending toward her with the unhurried confidence of predators who knew their prey was trapped. She counted heartbeats. Each one felt like a year. Click, click, weird. The sound changed, deeper, a heavy mechanical groan that she felt in her bones rather than heard with her ears. The clamp released her wrist. Her hand slid free, the index finger trailing a thin line of blood across the brass. The massive steel door popped open, not swung, not slid, popped, breaking the pressurized seal with a hiss of equalized air that smelled of filtered atmosphere and cold electronics. Isaac grabbed the edge of the door and held it open with both hands, the tendons in his neck standing out like cables. The door was enormously heavy, 4 inches of reinforced steel moving on precision hinges, and it took everything he had to swing it wide enough for a person to pass through. Inside, now. Cordelia ducked through the opening. Isaac followed and immediately threw his weight against the door, driving it closed. A heavy internal deadbolt, the size of a man's forearm, slid into its housing with a deep, satisfying clang. Half a second later, the first burst of automatic gunfire hit the exterior of the door. The sound was monstrous, a rapid hammering that filled the vault with percussive echoes. But the steel held. The bullets sparked against the surface and went nowhere. Cordelia collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, clutching her bleeding finger against her chest. Her lungs burned, her ears rang, she could feel her pulse in every extremity, the animal rhythm of a body that had accepted the possibility of death and was now recalibrating to the shock of continued survival. She looked up. The vault was not a cellar room. It was not a bunker. It was a command center. The space was approximately 30 feet square, with ceilings high enough that the emergency lights along the upper walls left the floor in relative dimness. The air was cool and dry, the product of a climate control system that hummed softly behind the walls. Racks of server equipment lined the eastern wall, their status lights blinking steady blue in the darkness, rows of encrypted machines that had been quietly storing data for decades. Filing cabinets, the heavy fireproof kind used by government agencies, occupied the western wall. And in the center of the room, bolted to the concrete floor, sat a titanium safe the size of a refrigerator, its surface polished to a dull mirror finish. On a desk near the server racks was a computer terminal, its monitor dark, connected to a keyboard and a series of external hardware modules by a nest of cables. Isaac moved to the terminal without a word. He sat down, powered on the monitor, and began typing commands with a speed and precision that confirmed everything he had told Cordelia about his past. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the fluency of a man who had spent years in operations rooms processing intelligence, coordinating assets, making decisions that determined whether people lived or died. Outside the vault door, the gunfire had stopped. In its place came a new sound, the dull, grinding shriek of heavy machinery being positioned against steel. Then a sharp, sustained hissing that Cordelia recognized from construction sites, a cutting torch. Thermal lances, Isaac said, without looking up from the screen. Military grade. They will cut through 4 inches of reinforced steel in approximately 14 minutes. That is how much time we have. 14 minutes to do what exactly? Die slowly instead of quickly. To finish what Josephine started. A progress bar appeared on the monitor and a green text readout confirmed that data was being transferred to an external device. Isaac pulled a small, ruggedized hard drive from a drawer and connected it to the terminal. The progress bar began to fill. The servers are wired to a deadman switch. If the vault is breached without proper authorization, the system will corrupt all stored data. Everything Josephine spent 30 years compiling will be destroyed. The portable drive is our only chance to preserve a copy. Cordelia got to her feet. Her legs trembled but held. She walked to the terminal and watched the progress bar crawl forward. 7%, 11%. The transfer rate was agonizingly slow. The physical evidence, she said, the ledgers, the originals. In the safe, Isaac gestured toward the titanium monolith in the center of the room without pausing his work at the terminal. Combination is 341288, Josephine's birthday. She said that anyone who deserved to open it would know that. Cordelia crossed to the safe. Her hands were shaking and she had to wipe the blood from her index finger on her jacket before she could grip the dial. She spun it carefully, right to 34, left past 0 to 12, right to 88. A heavy internal mechanism engaged and the lever moved freely. She pulled the door open. No money, no gold, no jewels. The contents of the safe were paper and plastic and magnetic tape, the raw materials of truth in their most unglamorous form. A stack of heavily yellowed ledgers bound in cracked leather, their pages dense with columns of handwritten numbers and annotations. Each ledger was labeled with a date range spanning from 1987 to 2015. Beside the ledgers sat a thick manila folder, its tab marked in Josephine's precise handwriting Win primary asset. And beneath the folder, wrapped in a sealed plastic bag, was a VHS cassette tape. The label was handwritten in block letters, Montana Facility Compound 7 Internal Surveillance, October 1998. Cordelia held the tape in her hands. It weighed almost nothing, a few ounces of plastic and magnetic ribbon. But she understood with a clarity that cut through the fear and the adrenaline that she was holding something that men had killed to possess and other men had died to protect. This tape was a window into a room that powerful people had spent billions of dollars trying to keep sealed. She set the tape on top of the ledgers and picked up the manila folder. She opened it. The first page was a photograph, black and white, slightly overexposed, showing a man in his early 30s leaning against the side of a delivery truck. He was wearing a flannel shirt and work boots, and he was smiling at someone just outside the frame. with the easy, unguarded warmth of a person who did not know he was being documented. It was her father, Emmett Wynne, alive, young, and completely unaware that the photograph was being taken by the woman who would one day get him killed. Cordelia closed the folder. She pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. The grief was a physical thing, a weight that settled in her sternum and made it hard to breathe. But underneath the grief, like bedrock beneath soil, was the rage. And the rage held her upright. Transfer is at 62%, Isaac called from the terminal. His voice was tight. On the security monitor beside him, a camera feed showed the exterior of the vault door. A brilliant orange-white circle of molten steel had appeared at the center, growing slowly outward as the thermal lenses did their work. Sparks cascaded to the floor in a shower of burning metal. How long? 6 minutes until transfer is complete. They'll be through the door in 10. That gives us 4 minutes to reach the tunnel. Cordelia gathered the ledgers, the folder, and the VHS tape and placed them on the desk beside Isaac. She found a waterproof canvas satchel hanging from a hook on the wall. Military surplus, heavy-duty, designed to survive conditions that would destroy most luggage. She began packing the physical evidence inside. Isaac, the folder with my father's name on it. What was he carrying when they killed him? Isaac's typing did not slow. A single ledger documenting the bribery of a federal judge, Judge Raymond Oster, 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. Stratton Mercer had purchased his rulings for 11 years. The ledger contained dates, amounts, and the names of intermediaries. Emmett was transporting it from a dead drop in Portland to Josephine's secure courier in San Francisco. He knew what he was involved in. He knew exactly what he was involved in. Josephine told me that he volunteered. She tried to dissuade him. She told him it was too dangerous. He told her that his daughter deserved to grow up in a country where companies couldn't murder people and call it the cost of doing business. The progress bar hit 78%. The orange circle on the vault door had expanded to the size of a dinner plate. The temperature in the vault was climbing, the air growing warm and acrid with the smell of superheated metal. He died for strangers, Cordelia said quietly. He died for the idea that strangers matter, Isaac replied. That is a different and more important thing. The progress bar hit 90%, 92, 95. The orange circle on the vault door was nearly complete now, a glowing ring of molten steel that cast harsh, flickering shadows across the vault's interior. Through the thin remaining section of uncut metal, Cordelia could hear voices, commands being issued, equipment being repositioned. The retrieval team was preparing to breach 98, 99, 100%, transfer complete. Isaac ripped the hard drive from the console and turned to the titanium safe. He grabbed a small leather-bound book from the top shelf, its cover worn soft with age. The decryption cipher. Without it, the data on the hard drive was meaningless, an ocean of encrypted noise that even the most powerful computers could not decode without the physical key. He shoved the hard drive, the cipher book, and the VHS tape into the canvas satchel alongside the ledgers. Then he reached into the bottom of the safe and pulled out 2 thick stacks of $100 bills bound in rubber bands and a small black burner phone, still sealed in its original packaging. He added them to the satchel and pulled the drawstring tight. Everything you need is in this bag, Isaac said, pressing the satchel into Cordelia's hands. The hard drive contains the complete digitized archive. The cipher book is the decryption key. Without the book, the drive is useless. The cash and the phone are for your extraction. My extraction to where? Seattle. There is a reporter at the Seattle Chronicle named Harlan Crew. Investigative desk. 16 years ago, he was a junior correspondent who tried to investigate your father's death. He was shut down by his editors under pressure from Stratton Mercer's legal team. He has been waiting for this evidence ever since Find him, give him the drive and the cipher book, he will know what to do. On the monitor, the glowing circle was almost closed. A thin arc of uncut steel, perhaps 2 inches, was all that remained. The men on the other side were seconds away from punching through. Isaac turned to the desk and flipped the red plastic cover off a physical switch mounted on the surface. The switch was industrial, the kind found on factory equipment or military detonation systems. Beneath the cover, a small metal toggle gleamed in the emergency light. The incendiary charges are placed at 14 structural points throughout the house, Isaac said. The detonation sequence requires a sustained manual hold on this switch for 30 seconds. After that, there is a 60-second delay before ignition. The charges will produce temperatures in excess of 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. The house, the servers, everything above us will be reduced to ash. Isaac, I will hold the switch. You will take the tunnel, you will run, and you will not stop running until you reach the highway. You don't have to die here. Isaac looked at her. The red emergency light carved his face into a mask of sharp planes and deep shadows. His pale blue eyes, which had held exhaustion and intelligence and carefully managed guilt since the moment she met him, now held something else entirely. Peace. The terrible quiet peace of a man who has finally found the purpose that justifies the rest of his life. I have been dying here for 22 years, Cordelia. Tonight I simply finished the process. He grabbed a heavy filing cabinet and dragged it away from the far wall. Behind it, a dark opening gaped in the concrete, a tunnel roughly 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall carved directly into the bedrock. The walls were raw stone and the floor was packed earth. Cold air flowed from the opening, carrying the smell of deep underground wet rock and ancient darkness. This passage was built during Prohibition by bootleggers running whiskey from Canada, Isaac said. Josephine extended it by approximately 200 yards. It runs under the mountain and exits through a drainage culvert near the old logging highway. From there, it is approximately 3 miles north to the truck stop on Interstate 5. The vault door groaned. The final section of uncut steel was buckling inward, glowing cherry red. A gap appeared at the top of the circle, and through it Cordelia could see a bright white flashlight beam probing the darkness beyond. "They're through," Isaac said. He pulled a heavy revolver from his waistband. It was an old weapon, a Smith & Wesson with a 6-inch barrel, the kind of gun that had no subtlety and no apology. He checked the cylinder with a practiced flick of his wrist, confirmed the loads, and snapped it shut. Then he placed his left hand on the detonation switch. His thumb found the toggle. "When I flip this switch, you run. You do not stop. You do not look back. You do not come back for me. Do you understand, Isaac? Do you understand?" The steel circle in the vault door fell inward with a deafening clang, crashing to the concrete floor and bouncing once before settling with a heavy metallic ring. Through the opening, Cordelia could see the harsh white beams of multiple tactical flashlights cutting through the smoke and the red glow. Shadows moved behind the lights. Men were positioning themselves to enter. "Cordelia, go!" She looked at him one last time. This man who had hunted her aunt and failed to save her father and spent 22 years trying to balance a ledger that could never be balanced. This man who had poured her tea and told her the truth and was now preparing to die so that the truth could leave this house. "Thank you," she whispered. Isaac Keller flipped the switch. A low resonant tone began to pulse through the vault, a mechanical heartbeat counting down the seconds. Isaac raised the revolver and aimed it at the glowing hole in the door. Cordelia turned and ran into the tunnel. The darkness swallowed her whole. The canvas satchel bounced against her hip as she sprinted, her flashlight beam lurching wildly across the rough stone walls. The tunnel was narrow enough that her shoulders scraped the rock on both sides, and the ceiling was low enough that she had to duck at irregular intervals to avoid outcroppings that reached down like grasping fingers. Behind her, muffled by the tons of earth and stone that separated her from the vault, she heard the first shot. The revolver's report was deep and heavy, a sound that belonged to a different era. Then a second shot, a third, then a pause, then the rapid stuttering hammer of automatic weapons fire, multiple weapons firing in controlled bursts. The sound was distant and distorted by the tunnel like a thunderstorm heard from the bottom of a well. Cordelia ran, her lungs screamed for air, her legs burned with lactic acid, her injured finger throbbed with every heartbeat, leaving a trail of blood on the satchel's canvas strap. The tunnel twisted and turned, following the natural seams in the bedrock, and twice she stumbled on loose stones and nearly went down. Each time she caught herself, adjusted her grip on the flashlight, and kept moving. Behind her, the gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the shooting. It meant one of two things. Either Isaac had surrendered, which she knew he would never do, or Isaac was dead and the countdown was still running. She counted in her head 30 seconds for the sustained hold, then 60 seconds for the delay. She had been running for approximately 45 seconds since the switch was flipped. That meant she had roughly 45 seconds before the incendiary charges detonated. She ran harder. The tunnel began to slope upward, and the air changed, growing slightly warmer, carrying traces of pine and rain. The exit was close. She could feel it the way a drowning person feels the surface, an instinctive awareness of proximity to survival. Then the mountain moved. That was how it felt, not an explosion heard from a distance, but the earth itself convulsing, as if something enormous buried deep in the rock had woken up and tried to roll over. The shock wave hit Cordelia from behind like a giant's palm, lifting her off her feet and hurling her forward through the air. She slammed into the ground face first, the satchel driving into her ribs, the flashlight spinning away and clattering against the wall. The tunnel filled with sound, a deep resonant roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the mountain was groaning in pain. Dust rained from the ceiling in thick curtains. Small rocks broke free from the walls and clattered to the floor. The ground shook beneath her for what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 3 or 4 seconds. Then it stopped. Cordelia lay in the dark, the flashlight dead or lost the dust thick in her lungs. She coughed violently, tasting earth and copper. Her ears rang with a high, sustained tone that obliterated all other sound. She reached out blindly, found the wall, and used it to pull herself to her feet. The satchel was still on her shoulder. She pressed her hand against it, feeling the hard edges of the drive and the cipher book through the canvas. Everything was intact. She found the flashlight by feel half buried in loose debris. She slapped it against her palm 3 times before the beam stuttered back to life, weak and flickering, but enough. The tunnel behind her was partially collapsed, choked with rubble and thick with hanging dust. Through the debris she could see a faint orange glow. Ravenwood was burning. The incendiary charges had done their work. The house, the servers, the vault, the body of the man on the library floor, and the body of the man who had guarded the house for 22 years were all being consumed by a fire hot enough to turn steel to slag and bone to powder. Isaac Keller had kept his promise. Cordelia turned away from the glow and faced the darkness ahead. The tunnel continued upward for another 100 yards before she saw it, a faint gray semicircle of natural light. The exit. A drainage culvert half choked with dead leaves and mud opening onto a steep wooded hillside. She crawled through the opening and tumbled down a muddy embankment, sliding through wet ferns and exposed tree roots until she came to rest in a shallow ditch at the edge of a cracked asphalt road, the old logging highway. Above and behind her, miles up the mountain pass, a pillar of orange fire tore through the heavy cloud cover like a fist punching through a gray ceiling. The flames were enormous, fed by the old timber and the accelerants in the charges, and they painted the underside of the clouds in shades of copper and blood. Ravenwood was gone. Cordelia lay in the freezing mud, the rain falling on her face, the canvas satchel pressed against her chest. She allowed herself 10 seconds. 10 seconds to feel the grief and the shock and the exhaustion and the rage. 10 seconds to mourn a man she had known for less than 2 hours, but who had given her more truth in that time than the rest of the world had offered in 32 years. Then she stood up. She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder, wiped the mud from her eyes, and started walking north toward the highway, towards Seattle, and toward the reckoning that Stratton Mercer Group had been running from for 3 decades. The Oregon rain had turned to sleet by the time Cordelia reached the highway. It fell in sharp, stinging needles that bit into the exposed skin of her face and hands, mixing with the mud and dried blood that covered her like a second skin. She walked with her head down and her arms wrapped around the canvas satchel, pressing it against her body the way a mother holds a child in a storm. The logging highway was deserted, no headlights in either direction, no sound except the hiss of sleet against pavement and the distant dying roar of the fire consuming Ravenwood somewhere high above her in the mountains. The glow had diminished to a faint amber pulse against the cloud cover like a wound in the sky that was slowly closing. Cordelia walked for 90 minutes. She counted the steps at first, a trick her father had taught her during long hikes in the Cascades when she was a girl. Count to 100, start again. It gives the mind something to hold on to when the body wants to stop. Emmett had been full of small wisdoms like that, practical philosophies delivered without fanfare, the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent his entire life doing hard things without complaint. She stopped counting at 3,000 and simply walked. The truck stop appeared around a long curve in the road, a small island of fluorescent light in the vast dark expanse of the Oregon mountains. A gas station with 2 pumps, a diesel island for long-haul rigs, and a diner attached to one end with a hand-painted sign that read, Ridgeview Cafe open 24 hours. 3 18-wheelers sat in the gravel lot, their engines idling, their running lights glowing red and amber in the mist. Cordelia pushed through the diner's glass door and was immediately hit by a wall of warmth and the smell of burned coffee and frying bacon. The interior was small, a counter with 8 stools and 4 booths. Along the window, the kind of place that existed in every small town along every American highway and would continue to exist long after the cities had reinvented themselves a dozen times over. A woman in her 60s stood behind the counter refilling a coffee pot. 2 truck drivers sat at separate booths, both absorbed in their phones. Nobody looked up when Cordelia entered. She caught her reflection in the dark window and understood why. She looked like a woman who had crawled out of a grave. Mud caked her jacket and jeans. A thin cut on her forehead had bled down her left temple and dried in a dark streak. Her hair was matted and tangled with pine needles. Her right hand was wrapped in a makeshift bandage torn from her shirt, the fabric already spotted with blood from the puncture on her index finger. She went to the restroom, locked the door, stood in front of the cracked mirror, and let the water run until it was warm, then washed her face and hands with the slow, methodical precision of a person performing a ritual. The mud ran brown and then pink and then clear. She cleaned the cut on her forehead. She unwrapped her finger and examined the puncture wound. It was small and clean, already beginning to scab. The brass lion had been precise in its work. She opened the canvas satchel and inventoried its contents. The ruggedized hard drive, mate black, approximately the size of a paperback novel, sealed in a rubberized casing designed to survive drops water in extreme temperatures. The leather-bound cipher book, its pages dense with handwritten alphanumeric codes. The VHS tape in its plastic bag, the manila folder marked Win Primary Asset, which she did not open again, the 2 stacks of $100 bills, each approximately an inch thick, and the burner phone still sealed in its blister packaging. She counted the cash. $12,000 in hundreds. Josephine had planned for this. Isaac had planned for this. Every detail of her extraction had been anticipated by people who understood that survival was a logistics problem and logistics problems required supplies. Cordelia tore open the burner phone packaging and powered it on. The phone was a basic model, no internet capability, no GPS, just a keypad and the screen. She stared at it for a moment, then turned it off and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Not yet. She bought a black coffee from the counter and carried it to the farthest booth. She sat with her back to the wall, facing the door, and realized that she had unconsciously adopted the same posture Isaac had maintained in the library, the habit of a person who expected threats to come through doorways. She thought about Isaac Keller. She thought about the last image she had of him standing in the red light of the vault with a revolver in one hand and a detonation switch in the other, his face arranged in an expression that she now recognized as something beyond courage. It was completion, the expression of a man who had finally arrived at the destination he had been walking toward for 22 years. She wondered if he had felt fear at the end. She hoped he hadn't. She hoped that the last thing Isaac Keller felt was the satisfaction of knowing that the switch was held, the countdown was running, and the woman carrying 30 years of evidence was already beyond their reach. A long-haul driver at the counter paid his check and headed for the door. Cordelia intercepted him in the gravel lot, the sleet stinging her face as she stepped into the harsh glow of the parking lot lights. "I need a ride to Seattle," she said. "I can pay $300 cash." The driver was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray beard and a Peterbilt cap pulled low over tired eyes. He looked at her mud-caked clothes, her bandaged hand, and the cut on her forehead. His expression did not change. Long-haul drivers on the I-5 corridor had seen everything, and the particular math of a woman alone on a mountain highway at 2 in the morning offering cash for a ride added up to a story that was none of his business. "I'm hauling lumber to the port of Tacoma," he said. "I can drop you in the city. Keep your money in your pocket until we get there." "I'd rather pay now." "And I'd rather you didn't. You look like you need that cash more than I need it tonight." He opened the passenger door of his cab. "Climb up. There's a blanket behind the seat." Cordelia climbed into the cab and wrapped herself in the wool blanket. The engine rumbled to life and the big rig pulled out of the truck stop lot and onto I-5 heading north. The heater blasted warm air that slowly thawed the numbness in her hands and feet. The driver did not ask questions. He turned on a classic country station at low volume and drove. In the warmth and the darkness of the cab, with the rhythmic hum of the 18-wheeler's tires vibrating through her bones, Cordelia pulled out the leather-bound cipher book. She opened it carefully, turning the fragile pages with steady fingers. Columns of handwritten codes filled every page, Josephine's meticulous hand recording the encryption keys that would unlock the contents of the hard drive. But as she reached the final pages, a loose piece of heavy parchment slipped from between the covers and fluttered onto her lap. The letter was written in Josephine's elegant, old-fashioned cursive, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a generation that considered penmanship a reflection of character. The ink was dark blue, the strokes confident and unhurried, the writing of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted to say and had been preparing to say it for years. "My dearest Cordelia, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and Ravenwood has served its final purpose. I am deeply sorry for the burden I have placed upon your shoulders, but you were the only variable that Stratton Mercer could not predict. They have spent 30 years hunting for the evidence. They have infiltrated law enforcement, corrupted judges, purchased politicians, and eliminated anyone who threatened their operations. But they could not account for a great niece they did not know existed until it was too late. You must understand the full scope of what has been done to you. The collapse of your architecture firm was not misfortune. Your partner Lowell Gentry was quietly approached by Stratton Mercer's fixers 18 months before the bankruptcy. They offered him a new identity and a substantial sum to drain the business accounts and disappear, ensuring that when the time came you would be desperate enough to claim the inheritance and travel to Ravenwood. Your financial ruin was manufactured, Cordelia. Every unpaid bill, every rejected loan application, every sleepless night in the back of that car was engineered by men who considered your suffering an acceptable operational expense. But they underestimated what I already knew, that the Wynn bloodline does not break. Your father proved that, and now so have you. In the lining of this satchel, you will find a routing number and access code for a secure account at a private bank in Geneva. The account contains $12 million. This money was siphoned directly from Stratton Mercer's black budget over the course of 28 years. It is the same money they used to finance their illegal weapons programs laundered through a series of shell corporations that I dismantled one by one. It is yours now. Reclaim your life, avenge your father, and burn them to the ground. With love and sorrow, Josephine Cordelia read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back inside the cipher book, and stared out the window at the dark highway streaming past. Her entire life, every failure, every humiliation, every night spent rationing instant noodles and calculating how many days she could survive on the remaining balance of a checking account that hovered near zero. All of it had been orchestrated. She had been hollowed out on purpose, reduced to a state of desperation so complete that she would have walked into a burning building if someone told her there was a paycheck inside. And she had walked into a burning building. She had walked into Ravenwood with nothing but a flashlight and the stubborn refusal to quit that her father had welded into her spine. And she had walked out carrying the evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful corporations in America. The tears came then, not the quiet, manageable kind. These were violent, convulsive sobs that racked her entire body and left her gasping against the cold window of the truck cab. She cried for her father who had died on a highway, carrying a stranger's secrets because he believed that strangers deserved protection. She cried for Isaac, who had spent 22 years paying for a sin of inaction and died with his hand on a switch because he believed that payment was still insufficient. She cried for Josephine, who had sacrificed her family, her freedom, and ultimately her life to preserve a truth that the world did not want to hear. And she cried for herself, for the 16-year-old girl who had stood in a hospital corridor and been told that her father was gone, never knowing that his death was not an accident but a sentence handed down by men in boardrooms who would never know his name. The driver glanced at her once, then returned his eyes to the road. He reached over and turned up the volume on the radio just enough to give her grief a thin curtain of privacy. It was a small kindness, and it was exactly enough. By the time the truck descended from the mountain passes and the lights of the Tacoma suburbs began to appear in the distance, Cordelia had stopped crying. Her eyes were swollen and her throat was raw, but underneath the exhaustion and the grief, something else had settled into place, something cold and precise and patient. The rage was still there, but it had changed form. It was no longer the white-hot fury that had seized her in the vault when Isaac told her about her father. It had cooled and hardened into something more useful. Determination, the focused, implacable resolve of a woman who had been given a weapon and intended to use it with surgical accuracy. At 5:15 in the morning, the truck pulled off the interstate at the south end of Seattle. The driver brought the rig to a stop at a truck staging area near the port, the air brakes hissing in the pre-dawn darkness. "This is as far as I go toward the city," the driver said. "You can catch a bus from the transit stop 2 blocks east." Cordelia reached into the satchel and pulled $300 bills from the stack. She held them out. "You said to keep it in my pocket," she said, "like we're here now." The driver looked at the money, then at her face. Something passed behind his eyes. Not pity exactly, recognition, the look of a man who had lived long enough to understand that some debts are not negotiable. He took the money. "Whatever you're carrying in that bag," he said quietly, "I hope it's worth what it cost you." "It is," Cordelia said. "Well, thank you." She climbed down from the cab into the cold Seattle morning. The city was still dark, wrapped in a thick, marine layer that muffled sound and turned the street lights into soft, hazy orbs. The air smelled of salt water and diesel and the metallic tang of coming rain. She stood on the sidewalk and watched the 18-wheeler pull away, its taillights disappearing into the fog like two red eyes closing. Cordelia caught the first bus heading downtown. She rode standing, her hand wrapped around the overhead bar, the satchel pressed between her body and the wall. The bus was nearly empty. A janitor in blue coveralls, a woman in nurse's scrubs staring at her phone, a young man with headphones whose eyes were closed. None of them looked at her. At 6:20 in the morning, Cordelia stood on the sidewalk outside the Seattle Chronicle building. It was a mid-rise tower of glass and steel in the heart of downtown, the kind of building she had once dreamed of designing. The lobby lights were on, and through the revolving glass doors she could see the security desk and the elevator bank beyond. She watched the entrance for 5 minutes, timing the rhythm of the building's morning routine. At 6:27, a group of 4 young people pushed through the revolving doors, badges clipped to their lanyards, paper coffee cups in their hands. The particular combination of exhaustion and anxiety that identified them as interns or junior staff arriving early to prove their value. They entered in a cluster, badges out laughing about something. Cordelia fell in behind them, close enough to be part of the group, far enough to avoid direct conversation. The security guard glanced at the badges of the first 2, waved the group through, and returned to his monitor. Cordelia kept her eyes forward, her pace matched to theirs, and passed through the turnstile behind the last intern before the guard looked up again. She took the elevator to the 5th floor. The newsroom was a large open space filled with clusters of desks separated by low partitions, the institutional chaos of a working newspaper. At this hour it was mostly empty. A few early bird reporters sat at their terminals, headphones on, typing, with the focused intensity of people on deadline. Cordelia found Harlan Crew's desk by the nameplate taped to the partition. It was a landscape of organized chaos. File folders stacked in precarious towers, empty coffee cups forming a miniature skyline, a half-eaten bagel on a paper plate that appeared to be at least 2 days old, printouts and clippings pinned to a corkboard that covered the entire partition wall, connected by a web of colored string that mapped relationships between names, dates, and events. Cordelia studied the corkboard. In the upper left corner, partially hidden behind the takeout menu, was a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Tacoma, man killed in hit and run, driver sold." The date was 16 years ago. A small photograph showed Emmett Wynn's face, the same gentle features Cordelia saw every time she looked in a mirror. Harlan Crew had kept her father's death on his wall for 16 years. If you're from legal, I already told Branford that I have 2 confirmed sources on the Port Authority story, and they can take their cease and desist and use it as wallpaper. The voice came from behind a monitor at the adjacent desk. Cordelia stepped around the partition. Harlan Crew was sitting in a swivel chair with his feet on an open desk drawer, a phone cradled against his shoulder, a pen behind each ear, and a styrofoam cup of coffee balanced on his knee. He was in his late 40s, lean and angular, wearing a corduroy jacket that had seen better decades and a loosened tie with a pattern that had faded beyond recognition. The bags under his eyes were deep enough to carry luggage. His hair was the color and texture of steel wool. He did not look up. "I'm not from legal," Cordelia said. She placed the heavy canvas satchel on his keyboard. The weight of it depressed 3 keys simultaneously, and a string of random characters appeared on his screen. "I'm Emmett Wynn's daughter." The coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. His feet came off the drawer. He looked up at her with eyes that went from annoyed to alert to something much deeper in the space of a single breath. He took in the mud-stained jacket, the cut on her forehead, the bandaged finger, the satchel on his keyboard. and the expression on her face that was not desperation or fear, but the cold, steady focus of a person who has passed through the worst night of her life and emerged on the other side carrying something that matters more than survival. "Come with me," Cruz said. He stood up immediately, not quickly, but with the controlled urgency of a man who recognized the weight of what had just walked into his newsroom. He grabbed the satchel, took her by the elbow, and steered her across the floor to a glass-walled conference room. He ushered her inside, closed the door, pulled the blinds, and turned to face her. "You have 5 minutes before the morning staff arrives and this room fills up. Talk." Cordelia did not give him the backstory. She did not tell him about the polished brass handle or the fire in the library or the dead man behind the curtain. She did not tell him about Isaac Keller's confession or the brass lion that had tasted her blood. She would tell him all of that eventually, but not now. Now was for the evidence. She unzipped the satchel, pulled out the ruggedized hard drive, and placed it on the conference table next to Josephine's decryption cipher book. This drive contains the complete unredacted financial history of Stratton Mercer Group from 1987 to present day, internal ledgers, wire transfer records, offshore account documentation, communications between Stratton Mercer executives and officials at the Department of Defense, evidence of systematic embezzlement and bribery of federal judges, and the funding of illegal chemical weapons testing programs on American soil. She placed the VHS tape beside the drive. "This is internal surveillance footage from a private prison facility in Montana where Stratton Mercer conducted human testing of chemical nerve agents on inmates. The footage is from October 1998. She placed the manila folder on the table. "And this is the documentation of my father's murder. Emmett Wynn was killed by a Stratton Mercer operative on Interstate 5 16 years ago because he was transporting evidence of judicial bribery. It was not a hit and run, it was an assassination." Cruz stared at the items on the table. His face had gone through several phases during her presentation, moving from professional skepticism through cautious interest and arriving at something that looked very much like controlled shock. He picked up the cipher book, opened it, flipped through several pages, and set it down again with exaggerated care as if it might shatter. "If this is what you say it is," he said slowly, "they will have people in this city within hours, if they don't already." "They already do," Cordelia said. "The retrieval team that came for the evidence last night lost men when the estate was destroyed, but their operation chief, a man named Victor Stroud, was not at the site. He'll know by now that the evidence survived. He'll trace my route." "Then we don't have time for a print cycle. We can't sit on this for the evening edition." "No, we upload the decrypted files to a secure server. Then you send the raw data simultaneously to the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and every major wire service. AP, Reuters, all of them. We make it so massive, so immediate, and so public that no amount of corporate influence can contain it." Crew looked at her for a long time. Then a smile spread across his exhausted face. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had been chasing a story for 16 years and had just watched it walk through his door carrying its own evidence bag. "Emmett's kid," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I should have known." He sat down, pulled the hard drive toward him, and connected it to a secure laptop he retrieved from a locked drawer. The cipher book went open beside the keyboard. Crew began typing, cross-referencing the alphanumeric codes with the encrypted files, and one by one, the documents began to unlock. They worked for 3.5 hours. Cordelia sat beside him, verifying the decrypted documents against the physical ledgers, matching dates and amounts, building the architecture of a case that spanned 3 decades. She was, after all, an architect. And architecture was nothing more than the discipline of making complex structures stand up under pressure. The evidence was staggering, page after page of financial records showing hundreds of millions of dollars siphoned from the Department of Defense contracts and funneled through a labyrinth of shell corporations into accounts that funded programs with innocuous code names. Project Whitefield, Project Dry Basin, Project Compound 7. Behind each code name was a horror. Chemical agents tested on prisoners who had been told they were receiving routine vaccinations. Communities near test sites contaminated with groundwater runoff. Whistleblowers who had attempted to report the programs and subsequently died in accidents that were never investigated. And running through all of it like a dark thread through a tapestry was Emmett Wynne. His name appeared in the ledgers as a courier designation. Wynne 7. He had made 14 documented deliveries of evidence between Portland and San Francisco over a period of 3 years. The 15th delivery, the one that killed him, was annotated in red ink with the single word terminated. Cordelia stared at that word for a long time. Then she turned the page and kept working. At 9:45, Cordelia's burner phone vibrated in her pocket. She had not given the number to anyone. She stared at the screen. Unknown caller. She answered. Miss Wynne? The voice was male, calm and cultured, with the careful diction of a man accustomed to speaking precisely. Please do not hang up. This is Desmond Cavill. Cordelia's grip tightened on the phone. Crew looked up from the laptop, his eyebrows raised. Before you say anything, Cavill continued, I need you to understand something. The number you are holding was programmed into that phone by Josephine Aldrich. She gave it to me 7 years ago, along with very specific instructions about when to use it. Those instructions stated, and I am quoting from memory, when Cordelia reaches Seattle with the evidence, call her and tell her the truth. The truth about what? About the fact that you sent me into a trap. I sent you into a window? Cavill's voice remained steady, but there was a tension underneath that Cordelia had not heard during the meeting in his office. The tension of a man who had been carrying a secret for years and was finally setting it down. Stratton Mercer had surveillance on the Ravenwood access road around the clock. They rotated teams every 72 hours. The changeover happened on Tuesday evenings between 6 and 10 p.m. That is a 4-hour gap in coverage. I scheduled your appointment so that you would arrive at Ravenwood during that gap. Cordelia was silent. I did not betray you, Cordelia. Josephine gave me a single task. Get you to the house before they are ready for you. The timing had to be precise. If you had arrived 6 hours earlier, you would have driven directly into an armed checkpoint. If you had arrived 6 hours later, the new team would have been in position. Isaac thought you were compromised. Isaac was meant to think that. It was part of the protocol. Josephine understood that Isaac's protectiveness would be heightened if he believed the threat included me. She wanted him at maximum alertness when you arrived. She was manipulating all of us, Cordelia. Every piece on the board positioned exactly where she needed it. Cordelia closed her eyes. The layers of Josephine's planning were vertiginous. A dying woman losing motor control to thallium poisoning had orchestrated a chess game across months and miles, positioning her lawyer, her warden, and her great niece like pieces on a board, each believing they understood the full picture, none of them seeing the entire design. There is a safe house, Cavill said. A furnished apartment in Belltown that Josephine leased under a corporate name 12 years ago. The rent is paid through the trust until 2031. The address is 417 Vine Street, Unit 9C. The key is inside the fire extinguisher cabinet in the hallway outside the unit. Use it if you need it. Why are you telling me this now? Because I am sitting in my office watching two men in a black SUV who have been parked across the street for the past 40 minutes. They arrived shortly after dawn. I believe they are waiting for me to leave the building. A pause. I am 71 years old, Cordelia. I have practiced law for 46 years and I have kept Josephine's secrets for the last 19 of them. Whatever happens to me today is the conclusion of a chapter that I agreed to participate in with full knowledge of the risks. Cavill Finish what she started. That is the only thing that matters now. The line went dead. Cordelia lowered the phone. Her hand was trembling. She relayed the conversation to Crew in clipped, efficient sentences. Belltown safe house. Crew said, his fingers never stopping on the keyboard. We might need it. I'm 90% through the decryption. Another 20 minutes. We might not have 20 minutes. Cordelia stood and walked to the conference room window. She looked down at the street 5 stories below. Morning traffic was building, the sidewalks filling with commuters carrying coffee cups and briefcases, the ordinary machinery of an American city starting its day. She scanned the street methodically the way she scanned a construction site looking for the element that did not belong. She found it in 11 seconds. A black sedan with tinted windows parked illegally in a loading zone directly across from the Chronicle building's main entrance. The engine was running. 2 men sat in the front seats, their faces obscured by the tinted glass, but their posture was unmistakable, rigid, alert, oriented toward the building's entrance with the focused attention of predators watching a watering hole. They're here, Cordelia said. Crew, do not look up. How many? 2 in a car across the street. There could be more, I can't see. We have 17 minutes of decryption left. Cordelia's mind shifted gears. The fear was still there, a cold knot at the base of her skull, but her training took over. She was an architect. She understood buildings. She understood how space is connected, how people move through them, how exits and entrances created patterns of flow that could be predicted and exploited. She had designed 3 buildings in downtown Seattle during her brief career with Wynn and Gentry. One of them was a mixed-use commercial property 2 blocks south of the Chronicle building, and she had spent months studying the infrastructure of this neighborhood during the planning phase. She knew the street grid, she knew the alley system, and she knew something that most people did not. Beneath Pioneer Square, 3 blocks east, was a network of underground passageways. The Seattle Underground, a system of subterranean corridors created when the city was rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1889, raising the street level by 1 to 2 stories and leaving the original ground floors buried beneath the new sidewalks. Most of the underground was sealed off or converted into tourist attractions, but Cordelia had studied the original infrastructure maps during a foundation assessment. She knew which sections were still accessible through basement connections in the older buildings. Harlan, when the upload is ready, can you send it from a different location? A laptop, a phone, anything portable. I can send it from my phone if I have the decrypted files on a thumb drive. The upload itself just needs an internet connection and 30 seconds. Then finish the decryption. Copy everything to a thumb drive. We're not walking out the front door. Crew looked at her. Then he nodded and typed faster. At 10:02, the decryption was complete. Crew copied the full archive to a thumb drive, pocketed it, and shut down the laptop. He grabbed his phone, his jacket, and a battered messenger bag. Cordelia slung the canvas satchel over her shoulder. They left the conference room and crossed the newsroom to the service elevator at the back of the floor. Cordelia hit the button for the basement. The elevator descended. The doors opened onto a concrete corridor lined with pipes and electrical conduit, the mechanical guts of the building that no one ever saw. Loading dock is at the end of this corridor, Crew said. Exits onto the alley behind the building. Not the loading dock. They'll have someone watching the alley. Cordelia turned left, following the corridor past the mechanical room and the electrical switchgear until she found what she was looking for. A fire exit door painted the same gray as the walls with the push bar and a sign reading "Emergency exit only, alarm will sound." She pushed the bar. The alarm shrieked for 3 seconds, then died. The system apparently as neglected as the rest of the building's basement infrastructure. The door opened onto a narrow concrete stairwell that led down to a sub-basement. The air was damp and cool, and the walls were old brick, much older than the Chronicle building itself. Where does this go? Crew asked. Crew? The Chronicle building was constructed on top of an older structure from the 1890s. The sub-basement connects to the original street-level infrastructure. If I'm right, we can access the Pioneer Square underground system through the foundation wall. If you're right, I'm an architect, Harlan, I'm right. They descended into the sub-basement. Cordelia found the connection point, a bricked-up archway in the east wall, but the bricks were old and the mortar was crumbling. She kicked twice and the section collapsed inward, revealing a dark passage beyond. The air that flowed through smelled of old earth and standing water. They dug through the opening and entered the underground. The passage was low and narrow, the ceiling supported by wooden beams that had been standing for over a century. Cordelia led the way with her flashlight, navigating by memory and architectural instinct, following the pattern of the original street grid that still existed beneath the modern city like a skeleton beneath skin. They emerged 4 blocks east, climbing through a maintenance access hatch into the basement of a coffee shop on First Avenue. The barista behind the counter stared at them as they walked through the shop and out the front door but said nothing. People in Seattle had learned not to ask questions about things that came up from underground. They were clear. Cordelia hailed a cab on First Avenue and gave the driver the address of the Belltown safe house. They rode in silence. Crew held the thumb drive in his fist like a talisman. Cordelia watched the streets behind them through the rear window. At the safe house, a clean, sparse, one-bedroom apartment with drawn blinds, and the stale air of a space that had been maintained but never lived in. Crew connected to the building's wireless network. He inserted the thumb drive into his laptop. He opened his email client and began composing messages. Department of Justice, Criminal Division, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Unit, Securities and Exchange Commission Division of Enforcement, Associated Press, Reuters, the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the investigative desk at every major newspaper in the country. Each message contained the same attachment. The complete decrypted archive of Stratton Mercer Group's 30-year criminal enterprise. At exactly 10 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, Harlan Crew looked at Cordelia. Once I hit send, there is no taking this back. Every newsroom in America will have these files within minutes. The government will have them simultaneously. Stratton Mercer's stock will crater. There will be arrests, there will be congressional hearings, and there will be people who will want both of us dead for the rest of our lives. Hit send, Cordelia said. Crew, hit send. The fallout was instantaneous. It moved through the American financial and political system like a shockwave, visible in real time on the television mounted on the safe house wall. By 11 o'clock, the story had broken on every major news network. Anchors interrupted regular programming with the gravity reserved for national emergencies. The word Stratton Mercer scrolled across every chyron in the country, paired with phrases that the corporation's army of public relations professionals had spent billions of dollars ensuring would never appear in the same sentence as their name: embezzlement, chemical weapons, human testing, cover-up. By noon, Stratton Mercer's stock price had plummeted 60%. Trading was halted twice. The company's board of directors issued a statement calling the allegations unfounded, which was immediately undermined by the raw documentary evidence now circulating in every newsroom in America. By 1 o'clock, the first federal warrants were issued, 12 of them targeting current and former executives, including the CEO and chief operating officer. By 2 o'clock, FBI agents in tactical gear descended on Stratton Mercer's corporate headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. Television cameras captured the surreal image of agents carrying out servers and file boxes from a building that had until that morning been one of the most secure private facilities in the country. At 2:15, Victor Stroud was apprehended by federal marshals at Dulles International Airport. He was standing at the gate of a private charter bound for a country with no extradition treaty, a leather briefcase in one hand and a passport in a name that did not match his own in the other. The marshals were not gentle. At 2:40, Birdie Calloway was arrested by Oregon State Police at a gas station outside Roseburg, 60 miles south of Willow Creek. She was carrying 3 cell phones, 2 handguns, and a laptop that, when later examined by forensic analysts, contained encrypted communications with Stratton Mercer's operations division spanning 5 years. Cordelia watched it all from the corner of the safe house living room. She sat in a straight-backed chair with a cup of black coffee that she held but did not drink, the canvas satchel at her feet, the television filling the small room with the steady, relentless narration of a corporation's destruction. Crew sat at the kitchen table, fielding calls from editors and producers and fellow journalists, his voice hoarse, his hands shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. He had waited 16 years for this story. He had kept a clipping of her father's death on his corkboard through 3 office moves and 2 changes of editorial management. And now the story had found him carried through the door by the dead man's daughter. At 3 o'clock, the coverage shifted. The Montana facility had been identified. Federal investigators, accompanied by hazmat teams, were en route to the site. The names of the inmates who had been subjected to chemical testing were being compiled from the records on the hard drive. Families would be notified, graves would be found. Cordelia thought about what Isaac had said in the vault, that Emmett Wynne had not died for strangers. He had died for the idea that strangers matter, and now, 30 years later, those strangers were getting their names back. At 4 o'clock, the apartment was quiet. Crew had left to meet with federal prosecutors who wanted to take his statement. He had offered to stay, but Cordelia told him to go. The evidence was out. The machinery of justice was grinding into motion. There was nothing left to do but let it work. Cordelia sat alone in the silent apartment. She reached into the satchel and pulled out the burner phone. She dialed a number from memory, a number she had memorized months ago when she was still trying to track down the man who had destroyed her business and left her with nothing. Lowell Gentry's number in Lisbon. The phone rang 4 times, 5, 6. Then a click, a sharp intake of breath, and a voice she recognized, though it had changed. The smooth, confident baritone of her former business partner was gone. What replaced it was high and thin and trembling, the voice of a man who had been watching the news and who understood with the dawning horror of a person seeing the headlights of an oncoming train exactly what was coming for him. Hello, who is this? If this is about Stratton Mercer, I had nothing to do with. I was told it was just a business arrangement. I didn't know about any of the pleas. You have to understand, I didn't. Cordelia listened. She listened to Lowell Gentry's voice crack and quaver and climb toward a register that sounded very much like weeping. She listened for exactly 3 seconds, then she hung up. She dropped the burner phone into the wastebasket beside the kitchen counter. She pulled on her jacket, slung the now empty satchel over her shoulder, and walked out of the safe house into the Seattle afternoon. The rain had returned. It fell in a soft, steady curtain over the city, washing the sidewalks and blurring the lights of the buildings into impressionist smears of gold and white. Cordelia walked with no particular destination, letting her feet carry her through streets she had once known intimately, streets she had designed, buildings for streets that had witnessed both her ambition and her ruin. She passed the block where her old office had been. The space was occupied now by a yoga studio. The sign for Wynne and Gentry Design was gone, replaced by something in a cursive font that she did not bother to read. She passed the parking lot where she had slept in the Honda. A delivery truck was parked there now, its driver unloading boxes of produce for the restaurant next door, unaware that the cracked asphalt under his boots had once been someone's bedroom. She walked until she reached the waterfront. She stood at the railing overlooking Elliott Bay, the grey water stretching out toward the Olympic Mountains, which were invisible behind the clouds. The rain fell on her face and she did not wipe it away. She thought about Josephine Aldrich, who had spent 30 years alone in a house that was both a fortress and a prison building, a weapon out of paper and patience, and the unshakable belief that the truth once assembled could not be destroyed. She thought about Isaac Keller, who had walked through the door of that fortress as a hunter and walked out as a guardian, and who had held a detonation switch with steady hands while armed men cut through the last barrier between them and the evidence that would end their employer. She thought about her father, Emmett Wynne, who drove a delivery truck and hummed country songs and believed that a man's worth was measured not by what he accumulated, but by what he was willing to risk for people he would never meet. And she thought about herself, Cordelia Wynne, who had entered Ravenwood as a woman with nothing left to lose and emerged as a woman holding every key that mattered. The silence that had followed her family for 30 years, the silence of buried evidence and unmarked graves and unanswered questions, was broken. It had been shattered by the sound of a brass lion closing its jaws around her finger, by the roar of a house consuming itself in fire, by the click of a send button in a quiet apartment, and by the steady, relentless hum of a truth that refused after all those years to stay buried. Cordelia Wynne stood in the rain and watched the water. She did not know yet what she would build next. But she knew with the certainty of an architect who understands that every great structure begins with a single line drawn on a blank page, that whatever it was, it would stand.